In the choking heat of the Vietnamese swamp, Sergeant Jack Griffin was closing in on a downed recon squad's last known position. A routine search and recovery mission turned deadly when the Viet Cong, patient and calculating, set a trap beneath the shroud of the jungle. Jack Griffin wasn't just another Marine lost behind enemy lines. For over a decade, he had served as a Force Recon specialist, a survival expert who had outlasted death in the most hostile environments. In the jungles of Laos, he had been the only man to crawl out alive. In the Mekong Delta, he had disappeared into the water and returned as a ghost. When the Viet Cong sprung their ambush, tripwires snapping, sniper fire cutting the air, they thought they had cornered another helpless American. They had no idea they were stepping into the domain of a predator. Griff didn't run. He adapted. He countered. He turned their own terrain against them, setting off a chain reaction that would shatter their forces. What began as a simple recovery mission would become a ruthless game of survival. The jungle would be painted in blood, and the Viet Cong would soon learn. You don't trap a man who wrote the rulebook on escape. The swamps of Vietnam would never forget the night a single Marine fought back and won. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The UH-1 Huey's rotors sliced through the humid night air, their rhythmic thump-thump-thump swallowed by the clouds. Sergeant Jack Griffin checked his equipment one final time. Combat knife, M16 with attached silencer, sidearm, 3 days of rations, medical kit, and the mission brief folded inside. A waterproof pouch? His fingers brushed against the small leather pouch hanging from his neck. A ritual before every drop. 2 minutes, Sergeant. The crew chief's voice barely carried over the chopper's roar. Griff nodded, his face betraying nothing. The darkness beyond the open door was absolute, a void that seemed to hunger for him. Perfect insertion conditions, no moonlight to catch a silhouette, no stars to navigate by. Just the compass in his head and the map etched into his memory. 1 minute. The chopper dipped lower, hovering just above the jungle canopy. The crew chief gave him a thumbs up, and Griff moved to the edge, rope in hand. With practiced efficiency, he wrapped the fast rope around his boot and gloved hands, then slipped into the night. The descent was controlled chaos, the sensation of falling countered by trained muscles and instinct. 50 feet of darkness rushed past before his boots touched the slick ground of the Vietnamese swamp. 3 quick tugs on the rope, and it disappeared upward as the Huey banked away, leaving him in silence so profound it felt like pressure against his eardrums. Griff crouched motionless, letting his senses calibrate to the jungle. The air tasted of rot and stagnant water, heavy with moisture that clung to his skin. He listened, past the fading helicopter, past his own breathing, for anything out of place. The swamp had its own language, the chirp of insects, the occasional splash of something breaking the water's surface, the whisper of leaves when there was no breeze. 5 minutes. 10. Only when he was certain he was alone did he move. 14 clicks to the target. 8 hours until dawn. The mission brief had been sparse by design. A Marine recon squad, 6 men including their commanding officer, Sergeant Hank Rollins, had gone dark 3 days ago. Their last transmission, cut short by static, mentioned contact with enemy forces. Command presumed them dead, another squad lost to the meat grinder of Vietnam. But their location had been deep in contested territory, where intelligence suggested the Viet Cong were developing new counter-tracking techniques. If Rollins's squad had gathered any intel before they went dark, retrieving it was priority 1. Griff moved like a ghost through the undergrowth, each step deliberate, testing the ground before committing his weight. The swamp was a natural minefield. Patches of seemingly solid ground could give way to sinkholes, tangles of roots could snap ankles, and every branch potentially concealed a venomous snake or tripwire. Just like Laos, he thought grimly. Don't think about Laos. But the memories surfaced anyway. Another jungle, another rescue mission gone wrong. 5 men lost because he'd been too slow to recognize the signs. Their blood was on his hands, a stain no amount of time could wash away. Not this time, he promised silently. Not again. 3 hours into his trek, the first signs appeared. A boot print, pressed into mud, its edges still defined. Recent. American-made. He followed the trail, noting how it moved purposefully rather than frantically. Not the pattern of men fleeing an ambush. The trail led to a small clearing where the vegetation had been disturbed. Griff dropped to one knee, examining the scene with practiced eyes. Spent shell casings partially submerged in the soft earth. Blood spatters on broad leaves, already turned brown. And there, tucked against the base of a tree, a standard issue radio, its casing dented and dark with dried blood. Something wasn't right. The scene suggested a firefight, but there were no bodies. No drag marks indicating casualties being moved. The blood patterns were too deliberate, almost staged. Griff's skin prickled with unease. Rollins's squad hadn't just disappeared, they'd been hunted. He found the field notebook wedged between the roots of a massive banyan tree, its pages stained with what could only be blood. The last entry, written in Rollins' precise handwriting, was dated 3 days ago. 0430. Movement south of our position. 5th time in 3 hours. They're probing, looking for weaknesses. Martinez claims he saw the same scout twice. Guy with a distinctive scar across his neck. That's not how they operate. Something's off. 0500. Radio's acting up. Can't raise. Base camp. Possible jamming. 0515. Perimeter breach. Not random. They knew exactly what... The entry ended in a smeared line that dragged off the page. Griff carefully tucked the notebook away. The missing squad hadn't blundered into an ambush. They'd been systematically isolated and targeted. Moving deeper, his trained eye began to spot the signs most would miss. A nearly invisible tripwire stretched across a natural pathway. A depression in the ground that could only be a punji pit, camouflaged with fresh vegetation. And most disturbing, a sniper's nest positioned with perfect sightlines to the clearing. This wasn't standard Viet Cong guerrilla tactics. This was something else, methodical, patient, the work of someone who understood both the jungle and their prey. As the pre-dawn light began to filter through the canopy, Griff found what he was looking for. A trail of boot prints leading away from the ambush site, deeper into the swamp. One set of prints was distinctly American, but the stride pattern was off, wounded, being dragged or assisted. He froze at a sudden sensation, the weight of eyes on his back. Without turning, he knew. He wasn't alone. Someone was watching, assessing, measuring his movements just as he had been tracking theirs. The hunter was now the hunted. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Griff eased his hand toward his sidearm, every muscle tense. The jungle had gone silent. No insects, no birds, just the oppressive humidity and the certainty of hidden eyes. Then, barely perceptible against the ambient sounds of the swamp, came a soft groan from somewhere ahead. Human, in pain. He moved forward cautiously, following the sound. The trail led to a dense thicket of vegetation that seemed deliberately arranged. As he pushed aside a curtain of vines, his breath caught. A figure lay slumped against a fallen tree, uniform torn and caked with mud and blood, face barely recognizable beneath days of grime and swelling. But Griff would know that lanky frame anywhere. "Mac?" he whispered in disbelief. Corporal David. McAllister's eyelids fluttered, revealing bloodshot eyes that struggled to focus. Griff? The word was barely audible, cracked with dehydration. Griff crouched beside him, instincts screaming. This was too convenient, too perfect. Mac was alive, but why? And why left here, positioned almost like bait? The realization hit him as Mac's eyes widened in warning. "It's a trap," he rasped. In that moment, Griff saw it. The nearly invisible filament wrapped around Mac's wrist, leading to a grenade nestled in the undergrowth. One wrong move, and they'd both be dead. As Griff's mind raced through disarming options, a twig snapped, somewhere to his left. Someone was approaching. The hunt had begun. Griff's hands hovered over the tripwire, his breathing controlled to near stillness. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. A Russian F1 grenade modified with a pressure-sensitive release. Move Mac carelessly, the pin pulls. Cut the wrong wire, the pin pulls. Breathe too hard, maybe the pin pulls. How long? Mac whispered, his cracked lips barely moving. 10 minutes. Griff kept his voice low. Maybe less. Mac's laugh was a dry rasp. Had worse odds in Saigon. His eyes, though glassy with fever, maintained their characteristic spark. Even half-dead, Mac hadn't lost his wit. Without taking his eyes off the trap, Griff reached for his canteen. Small sips, he instructed, holding it to Mac's lips. The corporal drank with desperate restraint, each swallow visibly painful. "You're 9 o'clock, Mac murmured between sips. "Tree with the bent trunk. Sniper's been there since dawn." Griff didn't turn his head, instead using his peripheral vision to scan the area Mac indicated. The position was masterful, elevated enough for a clear shot yet concealed by the natural foliage. He'd walked right past it. "Appreciate the warning," Griff said, his mind already calculating angles and blind spots. "How's your memory?" "Patchy," Mac admitted. "Everything before this comes in flashes. Remember Rollins shouting? Remember Martinez going down first?" Griff worked silently for a moment, fingers tracing the contours of the grenade and its triggering mechanism. The device was more sophisticated than standard VC fare. Someone with engineering knowledge had rigged this. "I need a distraction," he finally said. "Got anything flammable?" Mac's eyes flicked downward. "Left breast pocket. Zippo and a half-pack of Lucky Strikes. Bastards left it as a joke, I think. Can't exactly reach it tied up." Griff carefully extracted the lighter and cigarettes, his expression grim. "Why'd they keep you alive, Mac?" The wounded Marine's face darkened. "They wanted information. When that didn't work, they got creative. Then the lieutenant showed up." "Lieutenant?" "VC officer, spoke perfect English, called himself View. Than." Mac swallowed hard. "He's different, Griff. Watches you like you're an experiment. After he arrived, they stopped the questioning. Just tied me up here instead." Griff's stomach tightened. The trap wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Vu Than hadn't just anticipated a rescue mission, he'd counted on it. "On my signal, I need you to stay absolutely still," Griff instructed. "Not a muscle. Not a breath." Mac's mouth twitched into a half-smile. "Been practicing that all week." With calculated movements, Griff packed 4 cigarettes together, using shredded pieces of the 5th to create a makeshift fuse. He positioned the bundle behind a fallen log about 20 meters to their right, angled where the morning light would make the smoke most visible. "Old trick," Mac observed. "Think they'll fall for it?" "Not for long," Griff admitted. "But I only need 30 seconds." Returning to the trap, Griff methodically traced each wire with his fingertips, memorizing their paths. The primary mechanism relied on tension, release Mac, trigger the grenade. But the secondary fail-safe was what concerned him. Disturb the ground pressure plate, same result. "Ready?" he asked. Mac nodded almost imperceptibly. Griff flicked the lighter, ignited his improvised device, then returned to Mac with fluid. Efficiency. As smoke began to rise in the distance, he counted silently. 1,000. 2, 1,000. A bird call sounded from the direction of the sniper's position. A signal. Unnatural. Too deliberate. 15, 1,000. 16, 1,000. Movement in the underbrush. Someone approaching the smoke. Griff's hands moved with surgical precision, disconnecting the primary wire from the grenade while simultaneously bracing the pressure plate with his combat knife. 25, 1,000. 26 1000. Now, he breathed, sliding his free arm under Mac's shoulders. In one continuous motion, he lifted Mac while simultaneously withdrawing his knife from beneath the pressure plate. The trap clicked, but the severed connection prevented detonation. They had seconds before the sniper realized the diversion's purpose. Griff half-carried, half-dragged Mac through the undergrowth, moving perpendicular to both the sniper's position and the investigating patrol. The wounded Marine bit down on his lip until it bled, refusing to make a sound despite the obvious agony each movement caused. They had covered perhaps 30 meters when the sound of angry voices erupted behind them. The trap discovered, the bait gone. A single shot cracked through the jungle, but it was blind, frustrated, not the calculated fire of someone with a target. Griff guided them into a depression beneath the massive roots of an ancient banyan tree, the hollow space barely large enough for 2 men. He positioned Mac against the dirt wall, then pressed himself against the opening, weapon ready. For 10 excruciating minutes, they remained motionless as search parties crashed through the surrounding jungle. Orders were shouted in Vietnamese, occasionally punctuated by a burst of automatic fire into suspicious foliage. Gradually, the sounds receded as the search pattern moved away from their position. That was too easy, Mac murmured once the immediate danger had passed. Griff nodded grimly. They're not trying to find us, they're trying to hurt us. Using his knife, he cut away the remainder of the restraints around Mac's wrists and ankles, revealing raw, infected skin beneath. A closer examination confirmed his fears. Mac's right leg bore a poorly dressed bullet wound, the edges puffy and hot to the touch. How bad? Mac asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. You'll live, Griff replied, removing a field dressing from his pack. But not if we stay here. Can you walk? Mac's attempt at standing answered that question. His right leg buckled immediately, and only Griff's quick reflexes prevented him from collapsing entirely. Define walk, Mac grunted through clenched teeth. Griff applied the fresh dressing, then offered Mac a morsel of ration bar and another sip of water. The corporal's color was bad, pallid beneath his tan with a sickly sheen of sweat that spoke of infection taking hold. What happened to the others? Griff asked quietly. Mac's eyes grew distant. Execution style, one by one, made us watch. His voice dropped to a whisper. Martinez, Jones, Diaz. They went quick. Rollins, though, they took their time with him. And you? Played dead after taking a round in the leg. Convinced them I was bleeding out. Then Vuithan arrived and everything changed. Mac shuddered. He knew I wasn't dying. Said he had other plans for me. Griff checked his compass, mentally calculating their position relative to the extraction point. They were still 12 clicks from the LZ, through terrain that would be challenging for a healthy man, let alone one with a festering bullet wound. Mac, he began, his voice carefully neutral. The mission is to get the intel, Mac finished for him. I know. Leave me a sidearm and some water. I'll make enough noise to keep them busy. The offer hung between them, practical and selfless. The mission parameters were clear. The intelligence took priority over any rescue operation. Griff could move faster alone, complete the objective, make the extraction window. For a moment, Laos flashed in his mind. Another choice. Another man left behind. The weight of 5 dog tags still hung around his neck, hidden beneath his uniform. 5 promises to bring everyone home, broken in a single moment of tactical calculation. Not happening, Griff said flatly. Mac's expression hardened. Don't be stupid. We both know I'm slowing you down. One of us needs to complete the mission. We both will. Griff's tone left no room for argument. I didn't swim through 5 clicks of this godforsaken swamp to leave you for the VC's trophy collection. He fashioned a makeshift support from a sturdy branch, wrapping it with strips torn from his spare undershirt to create a crude crutch. We move at dusk. Less visibility, cooler air. You lean on me when you need to. As Mac reluctantly accepted the crutch, his face twisted into a grimace that might have been a smile. You always were a stubborn son of a bitch. Learned from the best, Griff replied, allowing himself the ghost of a smile before returning to business. Now tell me everything you remember about the ambush, start to finish. Mac closed his eyes, concentrating. Standard patrol, routine, sweep along the eastern ridge looking for signs of supply movement. Everything normal until the radio started acting up. Static at first, then complete failure. Jamming? That's what Rollins thought. Ordered radio silence, tightened formation, then we found the body. Griff frowned. What body? American. Pilot looked like. No ID, staged in a clearing like he'd been. Mac hesitated, searching for the word. Displayed. Rollins knew something was wrong. Ordered immediate withdrawal. That's when they hit us. Ambush? Mac shook his head. Not like any I've seen. No initial barrage, no shouting, just silence, then precision shots. One bullet, one man down. They knew exactly where to hit us. His voice grew distant. Like they'd been studying us. Griff processed this, unease churning in his gut. The standard VC ambush relied on overwhelming fire and chaos. This methodical approach suggested something different. A hunter who enjoyed the game more than the kill. Rollins said something before they took him. Mac continued, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper. Our last transmission before they executed him. He kept saying there was a ghost in the jungle, not VC, something else. What did he mean? Never found out. Vuthan put a bullet in his head mid-sentence. Something rustled in the underbrush beyond their hiding place. Too deliberate to be an animal. Too careful to be a standard patrol. Griff's hand immediately went to his sidearm, signaling Mac to silence. For several minutes, they remained, frozen, barely breathing. Then came the unmistakable sound of a twig snapping under weight, followed by the soft squelch of a boot being carefully extracted from mud. Someone was tracking them, not crashing through the jungle like the earlier search parties, but moving with practiced stealth. A hunter, not a soldier. They found us, Mac breathed, barely audible. Griff shook his head slightly. Not they, he mouthed. One tracker. Alone. The footsteps circled their position, pausing occasionally as if studying the ground. Whoever, it was knew their business. Following a trail most would miss, moving with the patience of someone who understood their prey might be listening. Griff's hand tightened around his weapon. One shot would end the immediate threat, but would bring every VC in a 5-kilometer radius down on their position. If they were going to move, it needed to be now, while they still had the advantage of the tracker's isolation. He turned to Mac, his decision made when the wounded Marine's eyes suddenly widened in warning. The footsteps had stopped directly above their hiding place. The footsteps above them paused. A shadow fell across the opening of their hiding place as someone crouched at the entrance. Griff's finger tightened imperceptibly on the trigger. His breath held, eyes locked on the sliver of light being gradually eclipsed by a human form. Then came the unmistakable sound of radio static, followed by rapid Vietnamese. The shadow wavered, then disappeared as the tracker stood and moved away, responding to some distant command. Jesus, Mac breathed when the footsteps had faded. That was lucky, Griff finished, holstering his weapon. Won't happen twice, we need to move now. Dusk was still hours away, but waiting had become a luxury they couldn't afford. The jungle grew more active as afternoon approached. Birds calling, insects humming, the occasional splash of something breaking the surface of stagnant pools. Natural cover for their movement if used properly. Griff helped Mac to his feet, taking most of the wounded Marine's weight as they emerged from their hiding place. The makeshift crutch helped, but Mac's condition was deteriorating, his skin hot to the touch, his breathing increasingly labored. Which way? Mac asked through gritted teeth. Griff hesitated, studying their surroundings. East led to the extraction point, but would also be the obvious choice, the direction any escaping Americans would take. North was deeper into enemy territory, a death sentence. South led back toward the ambush site. West, he decided, through the deepest part of the swamp. Mac's eyebrows rose. The part with all the warning, certain death markers on the map? Exactly. Griff adjusted his grip on Mac's waist. They'll expect us to avoid it. Progress was agonizingly slow. The swamp grew increasingly treacherous. Patches of seemingly solid ground dissolved into knee-deep mud without warning. Twisted, roots reached like grasping fingers from the murky water. The air thickened with mist and the sweet-sour stench of vegetative decay. They paused at the edge of a particularly forbidding stretch of brackish water, its surface covered in a film of luminescent algae. Something large moved beneath, creating ripples that disturbed the green sheen. "You can't be serious," Mac muttered, eyeing the water. "Afraid of getting wet?" Griff's attempt at humor fell flat as he tested the water's depth with a long branch. "Afraid of whatever's making that wake. Pretty sure it's not welcoming us to the neighborhood." Griff studied the ripples. "Crocodile, big one. But it's our best chance. VC won't follow us through. Too much risk, too little reward. Unless they're crazier than you are. That's what I'm counting on." With careful movements, Griff guided them into the water, each step measured to minimize disturbance. The fetid liquid rose to their thighs, then their waists, forcing Mac to balance precariously on one leg, while clinging to Griff's shoulders. The crutch floated beside them, tethered to Griff's belt by a length of paracord. Halfway across, a series of explosions echoed from the east, the direction they would have taken if heading straight for extraction. The VC had been waiting. The ambush confirmed Griff's suspicion. They weren't just being tracked, they were being channeled. "Someone's doing an awful lot of planning just for us," Mac observed, his voice tight with pain. "Not just for us," Griff replied. "This is bigger. Rollins's squad, that pilot Mac mentioned, they're perfecting something." The far bank came as a relief, though emerging from the water left them coated in clinging algae and mud. The stench would make tracking them easier, but it also masked their human scent, a calculated risk. As they moved deeper into the swamp, the terrain grew increasingly alien. Massive trees rose on stilted roots, creating shadowy cathedrals above mirrored pools. Vines hung like petrified serpents, while unseen creatures rustled in the canopy overhead. "This place," Mac murmured, his voice dampened by the dense foliage. "It's like the world forgot about it." Griff nodded, checking his compass. The needle swung erratically, affected by mineral deposits or some natural magnetic anomaly. He'd have to rely on his instincts now, on the patterns of moss growth and the position of the sun filtering through the leaves. They had covered perhaps a kilometer when Griff spotted it, a subtle disturbance in the undergrowth, too deliberate to be natural. Signaling Mac to stop, he crouched to examine the area more closely. There, partially obscured by mud and leaves, was a piece of tree bark approximately the size of a man's palm. Someone had carved into it with the point of a knife, leaving jagged, hasty marks. At first glance, it appeared to be random gouges, but Griff recognized the pattern immediately, a modified marine field cipher, one that Sergeant Rollins had developed for his squad. Carefully cleaning the surface, Griff deciphered the message. VT studies prey, patterns, predictable paths. Changes rules 3 steps ahead, not killing, testing. "Rollins," Griff said quietly, showing the bark to Mac. "Smart bastard knew they were watching. Trying to tell us something about Vuthan." Griff tucked the bark fragment into his pocket. "He's warning us that this isn't just an enemy officer following orders. Vuthan is developing tactics, using us as test subjects." The implications were chilling. Not just an ambush, but a laboratory. Not just soldiers, but specimens. The missing squad, the displayed pilot, Mac left alive as bait, all part of some larger experiment in hunting Americans. They continued westward, the swamp eventually giving way to slightly more solid ground as the afternoon waned. The relative silence that had enveloped them for hours was broken by a strange, rhythmic sound, not quite mechanical, but too regular to be natural. Following the noise, they came to the edge of a small clearing. The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by an unnatural stillness that raised the hair on Griff's neck. Something hung from a low branch at the clearing's center, something man-shaped. "Stay here," Griff whispered, easing Mac down against a tree. "Like hell," Mac protested, but his strength was fading and he lacked the energy to follow. Griff approached the clearing cautiously, senses hyper-alert. No birds called, no insects buzzed. The entire area seemed suspended in an eerie calm that spoke of recent human presence. The hanging figure revealed itself gradually as he approached, a corpse suspended by its ankles, arms dangling lifelessly toward the ground. It wore the tattered remains of an American flight suit, the name patch partially visible despite the caked mud and dried blood. Walker. "The pilot," Griff breathed, recognizing the name from mission briefings. Lieutenant James Walker, shot down 3 weeks ago, presumed captured. The body had been mutilated post-mortem, but not in the manner of typical VC intimidation tactics. This was methodical, precise incisions across major muscle groups, joints dislocated and reposed, the face frozen in an expression of terror that spoke of death while conscious. But what disturbed Griff most was the staging. The body wasn't displayed haphazardly. It had been positioned exactly where someone following their path would find it. Another message, another test of reaction. As he circled the grim display, his boot struck something metallic partially buried in the soft earth. Kneeling, he excavated what appeared to be a standard-issue dog tag, but not belonging to the pilot. The name stamped into the metal sent ice through his veins. Griffin, Jack TSGT USMC. His own tag, or rather, a perfect replica, right down to the small nick in the corner from a shrapnel impact 6 months ago. They knew he was coming, had known before he even boarded the helicopter. A faint click from the underbrush across the clearing jerked his attention upward. Moving purely on instinct, Griff threw himself sideways as a crossbow bolt thudded into the tree where his head had been a split second earlier. Rolling to his feet, he drew his sidearm in one fluid motion, firing twice toward the source of the attack. The suppressor muffled the shots to dull coughs that wouldn't carry far, but the damage was done. Their position was compromised. A figure darted between trees at the clearing's edge, smaller than most VC fighters, moving with the quick, nervous energy of youth, rather than the measured pace of an experienced soldier. Griff circled right, using the hanging body for cover, as he tracked the movement. The attacker was making a fundamental error, running in a pattern, retreating to the same covered position after each movement. Predictable. Amateur. Calculating the next likely position, Griff circled silently through the underbrush, approaching from the flank. When the figure darted to the expected hiding place, a hollow between two massive tree roots, Griff was already there, weapon leveled. "Don't move," he commanded in Vietnamese. The scout froze, crossbow half raised. He was younger than Griff, had expected, no more than 17 or 18, with a lean, wiry build and wide eyes that registered shock rather than hatred. "Put it down," Griff continued in the scout's language, gesturing toward the crossbow. For a moment, defiance flashed across the young man's face. His fingers tightened on the weapon, body tensing as if preparing to fire regardless of consequences. Then, something unexpected happened. The defiance wavered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. The scout's eyes darted over Griff's mud-covered form, lingering on the insignia barely visible through the grime. With deliberate slowness, he lowered the crossbow to the ground. "On your knees, hands behind your head," Griff instructed, maintaining his aim. The scout complied, movements stiff with reluctance but without the fatalism of someone expecting immediate execution. This wasn't the behavior of a hardened VC fighter. Something else was at play. Using strips of paracord, Griff secured the scout's hands, then quickly searched him for additional weapons. Besides a knife and the crossbow, he carried only a canteen, a small package of rice, and a folded piece of paper containing crude maps of the area, with American patrol routes marked in red. "Your name?" Griff demanded. The scout remained silent, eyes lowered. "Your name," Griff repeated, pressing the barrel of his sidearm against the young man's temple. "Nguyen Lin," came the reluctant answer. "Why the crossbow?" VC usually prefer more direct methods. Lin's jaw tightened. Orders. Whose orders? Lieutenant Vu Thon. The name came out with a mixture of reverence and fear. We are not to kill you quickly. We are to test you. Griff hauled the scout to his feet. Test me how? Lin's expression became guarded again. I do not question orders. But you hesitated, Griff observed. You had a clear shot before I spotted you. Something complex crossed the young man's face. Conflict, perhaps, or doubt. Lieutenant says Americans die easily. No challenge. But you... He paused, struggling with the admission. You move differently, like the jungle knows you. Griff studied the scout for a moment longer, then marched him back toward Mac's position, maintaining a firm grip on the bindings. The corporal had managed to prop himself against a tree, sidearm ready despite his deteriorating condition. Made a friend? Mac asked, eyeing the prisoner. Something like that, Griff replied, forcing Lin to sit with his back against a thick tangle of roots. He's one of Vu Thon's scouts. Was supposed to test my reflexes with a crossbow. Considerate of him to use silent weapons, Mac observed dryly. Wouldn't want to disturb the wildlife. Griff crouched before the scout. How? Any others are tracking us? Lin's expression remained impassive. Many, in groups of 3, different directions. And Vu Thon? A flicker of something, respect, fear, crossed Lin's face. He watches, always watches. Mac shifted uncomfortably, wincing at the movement. So what's the plan now? We've got a prisoner, a clearing, full of booby traps and probably half the VC in Vietnam about to converge on our position. Griff's mind raced through options, each more desperate than the last. East still led to the extraction point, but also straight into what was almost certainly an elaborately prepared killing zone. Continuing west would take them deeper into territory even the VC avoided. North and south were equally problematic. We need to change the game, he decided finally. They're hurting us because they think they know what we'll do, so we do the opposite. Which is? We hunt them back. Mac stared at him. With a fever case and a prisoner in tow? That's suicide. It's what they won't expect, Griff countered. Vu Thon has been studying American evasion patterns. He thinks he knows exactly how we'll react. So we flipped the script. Turning back to Lin, he asked, Where is Vu Thon's base camp? The scout's eyes widened slightly. You cannot... Not... Attacking it, Griff interrupted. Avoiding it, where? After a moment's hesitation, Lin nodded northeast. 3 kilometers. Old temple ruins. Many fighters. Griff checked his compass, noting the position relative to their current location and the extraction point. A plan began to form. Risky, borderline insane, but possibly their only chance. We move north, he told Mac. Skirt the camp's perimeter, then double back east toward the LZ when they least expect it. And the kid? Mac nodded toward Lin. Griff studied the young scout, noting the conflicted set of his jaw, the way his eyes kept darting between the Americans, as if reassessing earlier assumptions. He's coming with us, Griff decided. Insurance. As dusk finally settled over the swamp, they prepared to move out. Griff helped Mac to his feet, then secured Lin with a longer length of cord that would allow him to walk while remaining tethered to Griff's belt. You are already dead, Lin said suddenly, his voice low but clear. He just hasn't told you yet. Who hasn't? Griff asked. Lin's eyes reflected the dying light, haunted and certain. The jungle. It has already claimed you. You just don't know it. Griff tightened his grip on his weapon. We'll see about that. As they moved north into the deepening shadows, the weight of being watched returned. Heavier now, more immediate. They weren't just being hunted. They were being studied, their every move cataloged and analyzed by an enemy who saw them not as combatants but as specimens. The hunter's snare was tightening around them. But Griff had no intention of being caught like helpless prey. If Vu Thanh wanted to study American survival tactics, he was about to get an education. Night in the Vietnamese swamp brought a different kind of darkness, not just an absence of light, but a living entity that breathed, shifted and conspired with whatever lurked within its depths. Sounds carried differently through the humid air, distorted and disembodied. The splash of water could be 10 meters away or 50. The snap of a twig might be directly behind you or merely an echo from some distant movement. Griff had stopped, twice to check Mac's condition. It was deteriorating faster than he'd anticipated. The corporal's skin burned with fever, his breathing shallow and rapid. The infection was advancing, and without proper medical attention, sepsis would follow. Hours, maybe a day at most, before Mac would be too weak to move at all. They'd found temporary refuge in the hollowed remnants of a massive fallen tree, its interior spacious enough to shelter 3 men from both the elements and prying eyes. The rich smell of decaying wood masked their scent, another small advantage in a game where the margins between life and death were measured in whispers and seconds. "Talk," Griff demanded, crouching before their prisoner. Lin sat with his back against the curved interior wall, hands still bound behind him. In the ghostly blue glow of Griff's shielded flashlight, the young scout's face was a study in conflict, defiance warring with a growing uncertainty. "What does Vu Thanh want?" Griff pressed. "Not just to kill Americans, he could do that more efficiently." "He studies," Lin admitted after a long silence. "How you move, how you think, how you survive." "Why?" The scout's eyes flickered toward Mac's semi-conscious form. "Americans rely on weapons, on radio, on helicopters. Take these away, you become lost. Weak." A pause. "Lieutenant wants to prove this, to perfect methods." "Guinea pigs," Mac murmured from his position momentarily, lucid. "We're just lab rats to him." Griff processed this, the pieces aligning with what they'd observed. The other squad, Rollins' men, they were tests too. Lin nodded once. Different tests, different terrain, different... He searched for the word. Scenarios. "And the pilot? Walker?" Something passed across Lin's face. Discomfort, perhaps even disgust. "That was, different. Lieutenant said pilot had valuable information, but I think..." He hesitated as if the thought itself were treasonous. "I think he enjoyed the process more than the information." The implication hung in the stagnant air. Vu Thanh wasn't just a tactician. He was something darker, a man who had transformed the art of war into a personal laboratory for his own satisfaction. Mac's breathing suddenly hitched, his body convulsing with chills despite the swamp's oppressive heat. Griff moved to his side, checking his pulse, too rapid, too thready. "He needs antibiotics," Griff muttered, more to himself than to Lin. "Real medical attention." "He will die," Lin stated, not unkindly, merely factual. "Like the others." Griff turned, his expression hardening. "No, not like the others." Returning to his pack, he inventoried their dwindling supplies. The field medical kit contained basic essentials, bandages, morphine syrettes, sulfa powder, but nothing that would combat the systemic infection spreading through Mac's bloodstream. They needed more. They needed to change the game. "Your people," Griff addressed Lin again, "they're expecting you to report back?" A guarded nod. "When?" "Dawn," Lin admitted. "If I do not return, they will know I am dead or captured." Griff considered this, a plan crystallizing. "And they'll search for you." "Yes. Lieutenant values his scouts. We are trained." "How many others like you?" 3 remain in this area." Griff's mind raced through calculations, patrol patterns, search protocols, reaction times. The VC wouldn't abandon a valuable asset like Lin, especially one with knowledge of their operations. They would search, and in searching, they would be predictable. For the first time since entering the swamp, predictability was an advantage they could exploit. "Here's what happens next," Griff informed Lin, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. At dawn, we're moving northeast toward your camp. Mac stirred. That's suicide, he managed between labored breaths. Not to the camp, Griff clarified. Near it, the closest VC medical cache. Lynn's eyes widened slightly. How do you? Standard VC protocol. Forward operating bases maintain medical supplies within a click of the main position, close enough for quick access, far enough to avoid losing everything in a single strike. The scout's expression confirmed Griff's assessment. You're going to help us find it, Griff continued. In return, you get to live. I cannot betray. You already have, Griff cut him off. The moment you hesitated with that crossbow. The moment you lowered it instead of taking the shot. Vuthan doesn't tolerate hesitation. Fear flashed across Lynn's face, quickly masked but unmistakable. Not fear of Griff, but of returning to face his commander's judgment. He would know, Lynn whispered. He always knows. Then help us, Griff pressed. Help us and disappear. The war is bigger than one lieutenant's experiments. The scout fell silent, internal conflict evident in every tense line of his body. Mac's condition forced them to wait out the night, conserving strength and allowing the fevered Marine brief periods of fitful sleep. Griff maintained a vigilant watch, attuned to every sound that penetrated their shelter. The distant calls of night birds, the occasional splash of something large moving through water, and twice, the faint but unmistakable sound of human movement, passing nearby. They were being circled, assessed from afar, predators studying prey. Dawn arrived as a gradual lightening of the oppressive darkness, the sun's direct rays blocked by the dense canopy overhead. With it came increased activity. Birds announcing the new day, insects renewing their constant chorus, and the heightened risk of detection. Griff roused Mac gently. The corporal's condition had worsened overnight, his face gaunt and slick with sweat, eyes glassy when they managed to focus at all. Time to move, Griff informed him. Ready to dance, Mac mumbled, the attempt at humor undermined by the effort it cost him. After checking Lynn's bindings and giving him a small portion of water, Griff outlined their approach. We move in 50-meter increments. Stop, listen, proceed, single file, Mac between us. And if we encounter others? Lynn asked. Griff's expression was stone. Pray we don't. They emerged from their shelter into the murky half-light of dawn, the swamp draped in tendrils of ground fog that curled around tree trunks and slithered across the surface of stagnant pools. Visibility was limited to 20 meters at best, another variable in the deadly equation of their survival. Griff took point, moving with the deliberate grace of someone who understood that speed was secondary to silence. Mac followed, each step a testament to sheer willpower over physical limitation. Lynn brought up the rear, hands still bound but now in front of him to allow better balance on the treacherous terrain. They had covered perhaps 300 meters when Griff froze, raising a closed fist, the universal signal to halt. Ahead, barely visible through the mist and foliage, a patrol of 4 VC fighters moved across their path, weapons ready, eyes scanning the undergrowth. Griff signaled for them to retreat slowly, finding cover behind a massive buttress root. Patrol passed within 10 meters of their position, close enough that Griff could see the pattern of mud splatters on their uniforms, could hear their hushed conversation. Searching for me, Lynn whispered once they'd passed. They say the American ghost has taken their brothers. American ghost? Griff questioned. You, Lynn clarified. Some believe you are not human. A spirit that moves without sound, kills without being seen. A ghost in the jungle. The phrase Rollins had used in his final transmission suddenly took on new meaning. When the patrol had disappeared from view, they resumed their careful progress toward the northeast. The terrain gradually changed, the ground becoming firmer, the massive trees giving way to thinner, younger growth, evidence of an area that had been cleared in the not-too-distant past and was still recovering. Close, Lynn murmured as they paused at the edge of what had once been a rice paddy, now reclaimed by the relentless jungle. Camp is beyond those hills. He nodded toward a ridgeline perhaps a kilometer distant. And the medical cache? Lynn, hesitated, then indicated a direction slightly east of their current heading. There, small hut. Looks abandoned. 2 guards, maybe 3. Griff assessed their position relative to both the cache and their ultimate extraction point. They were moving away from safety, deeper into enemy territory on the word of a captured scout who had every reason to lead them astray. And yet, Lin's information had proven accurate so far. The patrol patterns, the terrain changes, the camp location visible in the distance, all matched his descriptions. Either he was being truthful, or he was part of an elaborate deception that had anticipated their every move. Mac stumbled suddenly, nearly falling before Griff caught him. The corporal's skin burned against Griff's arm, his eyes unfocused. "Can't," Mac began, his voice a dry rasp. "You can," Griff insisted. "One more push, then rest." But Mac's condition had reached a critical point. Without immediate medical intervention, the next few hours would decide whether he lived or died. The time for caution had passed. Griff made his decision. "New plan," he announced, easing Mac down to a seated position against a tree trunk. "I'm going alone. You two stay here." "No," Mac protested weakly. "Not negotiable," Griff replied, injecting as much authority into his voice as possible. "You're in no condition to move, and I need someone to watch him." He nodded toward Lin. "And if you don't come back?" Mac asked, the question hanging between them like a physical weight. Griff removed his sidearm, checking the magazine before placing it in Mac's hand. "Then you do what needs to be done." Both men understood the implication. 1 bullet for Lin, 1 for himself. Better than what awaited them if captured. Turning to Lin, Griff cut his bindings. The scout rubbed his wrists, surprise evident in his expression. "I'm trusting you," Griff said simply. "Don't make me regret it." Lin's brow furrowed. "Why?" "Because you could have killed me in that clearing. You didn't. That means something." Without waiting for a response, Griff stripped down to the essentials. Knife, primary weapon, a length of cord, and a single grenade. Everything else would only slow him down. "The hut," he addressed Lin once more. "Describe it. Every detail." The scout provided a precise layout. A simple structure with a thatched roof, single entrance facing south, 2 small windows, elevated on stilts to protect against flooding. 2 guards normally stationed outside rotated every 4 hours. Inside, supplies organized by type: ammunition, food, medicine. The antibiotics, Griff pressed. "Where exactly?" "Metal box, green. Back wall, high shelf." Griff committed the details to memory, then turned to Mac. 2 hours. If I'm not back, assume I won't be. Mac managed a weak salute. "Give 'em hell, Griff." With a final nod, Griff melted into the underbrush, moving east toward the medical cache. The mission had evolved from intelligence gathering to rescue, from evasion to infiltration. The hunter was now the hunted, but the game remained the same: survive at all costs. He covered ground rapidly once away from the others, moving with a speed and silence born from years of training and the desperate knowledge that Mac's life depended on his success. The jungle seemed to part before him, offering paths where none had been visible before, concealing his passage in ways that felt almost collaborative. Perhaps there was truth to the VC whispers. Perhaps he had become a ghost after all. A kilometer. From his starting point, Griff paused, sensing a change in the environment. The jungle had thinned further, and ahead a small clearing contained what appeared to be an ancient stone marker, weather-worn and covered in moss, but distinctly man-made. Something about the scene triggered a warning in his mind. It was too perfect, too convenient. An obvious landmark that begged investigation. The kind of thing that would draw an American soldier's attention. Suspicion confirmed, Griff circled wide around the clearing, stopping when he spotted the telltale signs of disturbance in the earth. A punji pit, meticulously concealed beneath a layer of natural materials. Beside it, a nearly invisible tripwire stretched across what would have been his most likely approach path. Vu Than's work. The lieutenant had anticipated not just their general direction, but the specific route a trained American would select through this terrain. Continuing his circumnavigation, Griff identified 3 more traps, each positioned precisely where training would have directed him to move. It wasn't just skill, it was a near-perfect prediction of American tactical doctrine. The realization was chilling. Viet Cong hadn't just studied American soldiers, he'd dissected their training, their instincts, their very thought processes. He wasn't hunting men, he was exploiting a methodology. But Griff had long ago learned that doctrine was merely a foundation, not a limitation. In the unforgiving crucible of actual combat, survival depended on adaptation, on transcending training rather than being constrained by it. Moving with renewed caution, he charted a path no training manual would recommend, through a section of swamp that reeked of rot and decay, where the ground never fully solidified underfoot and every step risked sinking into unseen depths. It was the path least likely to be trapped precisely because it was the path least likely to be taken. The gamble paid off. Half an hour later, he caught his first glimpse of the medical cache, a small hut raised on stilts, exactly as Lin had described. 2 guards stood outside, cigarettes glowing in the dim morning light as they conversed in low tones. Standard procedure would call for eliminating the guards quickly and quietly. But standard procedure was what Viet Cong was counting. Instead, Griff backtracked 50 meters, selecting a position where the underbrush was thickest. Using his knife, he carefully cut several vines of varying thickness, stripping their outer layers to reveal the fibrous core. With practiced hands, he wove them together into a crude but effective snare. Next came fire, a small controlled blaze using damp vegetation that would produce maximum smoke with minimal flame. Positioning it carefully downwind of his target, he ignited it using max Zippo, then retreated to a flanking position. The reaction was exactly as he'd anticipated. 1 guard noticed the smoke first, alerting his companion. After a brief discussion, one remained at his post while the other moved to investigate. Standard protocol for a potential threat that didn't immediately endanger their position. The investigating guard moved cautiously, but predictably, along the most direct path toward the smoke source. When he reached the prepared area, Griff triggered the snare, a simple but effective mechanism that yanked the guard off his feet and left him dangling upside down, his weapon fallen from surprised hands. Before the guard could shout a warning, Griff was on him. 1 hand clamped over his mouth while the other delivered a precise blow to the temple. The guard went limp, unconscious, but alive. 1 down, 1 to go. The second guard, growing concerned at his companion's extended absence, made the fatal error of calling out. When no response came, he hesitated, clearly torn between maintaining his post and investigating. Training won out. He remained at his position but raised his weapon to a ready stance, eyes scanning the perimeter with newfound intensity. Griff circled behind the hut, using its elevation to his advantage. The stilts created a shadowed space beneath the structure, perfect concealment for his approach. Moving silently from one support post to another, he positioned himself directly beneath the remaining guard. With a sudden explosive movement, Griff surged upward, reaching through the gaps in the bamboo flooring to seize the guard's ankles. A sharp pull brought the man crashing down. His surprised cry cut short as his head struck the platform edge. He lay stunned, blood trickling from a scalp wound as Griff emerged from beneath the hut to deliver a finishing blow that ensured unconsciousness. 2 guards neutralized, neither dead, neither able to raise an alarm. Unconventional, unpredictable. Exactly what Viet Cong wouldn't expect from American forces. The hut's interior was Spartan but organized, shelves lining the walls filled with carefully labeled containers. Griff moved quickly to the back wall, locating the green metal box Lin had described. Inside, neatly arranged vials and packages contained various medications, some American in origin, likely captured from raids on U.S. positions. He selected a course of broad-spectrum antibiotics along with morphine, clean dressings, and several packets of powdered plasma. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A wooden crate partially covered by a tarp in the corner. Curiosity overrode caution. Lifting the tarp, he discovered not VC supplies, but something far older. Equipment bearing the weathered insignia of the Viet Minh, the revolutionary independence movement that had fought against the French colonial forces a decade earlier. The cache hadn't been built by the VC. It had been repurposed from an older installation, one dating back to a different war, a different enemy. Inside the crate, beneath layers of protective oilcloth, Griff found a treasure trove of survival. Tools, compass, maps of the region drawn with meticulous detail, wire snares, and most valuable of all, a shortwave radio. The radio was ancient, its casing dented and worn, but the essential components appeared intact. If it functioned, it could mean communication with the extraction team, the difference between lingering death in the swamp and a fighting chance at survival. Griff packed his findings quickly, securing them in a canvas bag found among the supplies. Time was running short. The patrol would eventually discover their missing comrades, and the entire area would be swarming with searchers. As he prepared to exit, movement outside caught his attention. A flash of uniform through the window, too deliberate to be wind-blown foliage. A third guard, unmentioned by Lin, or perhaps a patrol checking in. Griff pressed himself against the wall beside the doorway, knife ready. Footsteps approached cautiously, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of a weapon being readied. The figure appeared in the doorway, backlit by the strengthening morning light. Not a guard, a scout, similar in build and equipment to Lin, but older, his movements betraying years of experience that Lin lacked. The scout sensed the ambush a split second too late. As he turned, Griff struck, a lightning-fast movement that sent them both tumbling to the floor. The struggle was brief but violent, ending with Griff's knife pressed against the scout's throat. "Quiet," Griff hissed in Vietnamese. The scout's eyes burned with hatred, but he remained still, recognizing the deadly intent behind the blade. "American ghost," he spat, voice barely above a whisper. "Tell Vu Thanh," Griff replied, applying just enough pressure to draw a thin line of blood, "that his experiment has changed." With a precise blow, Griff rendered the scout unconscious, then bound and gagged him using strips torn from the man's own clothing. It would buy them time. Not much, but perhaps enough. Gathering his supplies, Griff exited the hut and melted back into the jungle, retracing his path with greater urgency now that his mission was accomplished. The swamp welcomed him back into its embrace, concealing his passage with the same strange complicity he'd felt earlier. He had covered perhaps half the distance back to Mac and Lin when the stillness behind him erupted with shouts and the sharp crack of a signal shot. The unconscious men had been discovered. The hunt would intensify now, with Vu Thanh surely realizing that his quarry was no ordinary soldier. When Griff finally reached the concealed position where he'd left Mac and Lin, he found them exactly as he'd left them. Mac semi-conscious, Lin sitting nearby, unbound and seemingly at ease. "You returned," Lin observed, surprise evident in his voice. "I did not think you would." "Didn't have much choice," Griff replied, kneeling beside Mac to check his condition. The corporal's pulse was thready but present, his breathing shallow but stable. Working quickly, Griff prepared the first dose of antibiotics, administering the injection with practiced efficiency. The medical supplies he'd recovered would help, but Mac needed proper treatment, and soon. "They know," Lin said quietly, as Griff worked. "They found your message." Griff glanced up sharply. "How do you know that?" The scout pointed toward the distant hills. "Signal shots, 3 in sequence, then 2. It means enemy has engaged and escaped. Lieutenant will be angry." "Good," Griff stated flatly, turning his attention back to Mac. "You do not understand," Lin insisted, his voice taking on an urgent quality. "When he is angry, he becomes different, more dangerous. He will not stop now." "Neither will I," Griff replied. As he finished treating Mac's wounds with the clean dressings, Griff revealed his other find, the shortwave radio from the Viet Minh cache. It was their potential salvation if it still functioned after years of storage. "Can you fix it?" Mac asked, his voice stronger than it had been in hours, the antibiotics already beginning their work. "We'll find out," Griff answered, examining the radio's interior components. Several connections had corroded, and the power source was questionable, but the essential elements seemed intact. As he worked on the radio, Lin moved closer, watching with undisguised curiosity. "Why do you fight so hard?" he asked suddenly. "For him." He nodded toward Mac. "For your country? Why?" Griff's hands paused momentarily. "For both, and for the ones who didn't make it out." His fingers brushed against the small leather pouch hanging from his neck, the one he'd checked before dropping into the swamp. Inside were 5 dog tags, names worn smooth from constant handling. 5 men lost in Laos because he'd made the wrong call. 5 ghosts that haunted his every decision. "Your ghosts," Lin observed with unexpected insight. "They follow you." "They remind me," Griff corrected, returning to his work on the radio. After 30 minutes of delicate adjustments, the radio emitted a faint hum, power flowing through circuits that had lain dormant for years. Griff tuned it carefully, searching for the frequency used by American forces for extraction coordination. When he found it, he keyed the microphone, voice steady, despite the surge of hope the connection represented. "Phoenix Actual, this is Spectre 27, authentication code Lima Tango 3906, over." Static answered him, broken occasionally by fragments of transmission too garbled to understand. He repeated the call, adjusting the frequency slightly with each attempt. On the 4th try, a response crackled through the speaker, distorted but unmistakably American. "Spectre 27, this is Phoenix Actual, authentication confirmed, report status, over." Griff felt the weight on his shoulders lighten fractionally. "Phoenix Actual, 1 wounded requiring immediate medevac. Request extraction at coordinates." He provided their position, then added, "Be advised, area is hot. Repeat, area is hot. Over." The reply came through clearer this time. "Copy Spectre 27. Extraction in 6 hours at designated LZ Whiskey. Can you confirm? Over." 6 hours, a lifetime in their current situation, but also their only chance. "Confirmed, Phoenix. We'll be there. Out." As Griff lowered the handset, he found both Mac and Lin watching him, one with renewed hope, the other with growing conflict. 6 hours, Mac breathed. "Think we can make it?" Griff calculated the distance to the LZ, factoring in Mac's condition and the certainty of pursuit. "We have to." Turning to Lin, he asked, "What will Vuthan do now?" The scout's expression darkened. "Everything. He will send all scouts, all soldiers. He will not allow you to escape, not now." "Then we change the game again," Griff decided. "We make him focus on us so completely that he misses what we're actually doing." Lin tilted his head questioningly. "A false trail," Griff explained. "So obvious, so tempting that he can't ignore it. While his forces chase ghosts, we slip through to the extraction point." "And me?" Lin asked, the question simple, but weighted with implication. Griff studied him, searching for deceit and finding only uncertainty. "Your choice. Help us, and I'll make sure you're clear before extraction. Return to your unit, and we're enemies again." The scout's internal conflict played across his features, duty warring with something else, something that might have been the first stirrings of independence from the ideology that had shaped his young life. "He would kill me," Lin said finally, "for failing, for hesitating, for talking to you." A pause. "I will help." With the decision made, they formed their plan. Griff would create the false trail, obvious enough to draw pursuit, but layered with enough complexity to keep Vuthan's forces occupied. Meanwhile, Lin would guide Mac along a less direct but safer route toward the extraction point. "If this is a trick," Griff warned Lin, "if you lead him into an ambush." "It is not a trick," Lin replied with unexpected dignity. "Some wars are chosen for us. This choice is mine." As Griff prepared to separate from the others, Mac gripped his arm with surprising strength. "Don't get dead," he ordered. "I didn't drag my ass through this swamp just to tell your mother you played hero at the finish line." Griff allowed himself a small smile. "Save it for the debrief, Corporal." With a final check of their planned rendezvous point, Griff headed south, the opposite direction from their true destination. He moved with deliberate carelessness, leaving signs that any competent tracker would spot. Broken branches, disturbed earth, even occasional boot prints where the ground was soft enough to hold an impression. The trap was set. Now they would see just how good Lieutenant Viet Cong really was, and whether a ghost could outmaneuver a hunter in his own jungle. Blood had a peculiar quality in the jungle. It didn't just stain, it transformed. Within hours, the rich copper scent fermented into something primal and sickly sweet. Animal senses recognized it instantly as a warning. Death had visited here. Griff surveyed the aftermath of his ambush with clinical detachment, counting 4 VC fighters sprawled among the undergrowth. They had pursued his false trail with predictable eagerness, walking directly into the kill zone he'd prepared, a narrow ravine with limited visibility and no easy escape routes. The fight had been brief, but intense. 2 dead from his initial volley, a 3rd from a grenade, the 4th in close quarters combat that had left Griff with a shallow gash across his ribs. Not his cleanest work, but effective. As he methodically searched the bodies for useful supplies, Griff maintained a mental countdown. 3 hours since he'd split from Mac and Lin, 2 hours until their scheduled rendezvous, 4 until extraction. Each minute represented distance that Mac, even with antibiotics beginning to work, would struggle to cover. The first 3 fighters yielded little beyond ammunition and ration packets. The 4th, however, was different. His uniform bore no rank insignia, yet the quality of his equipment suggested importance. A Soviet-made pistol rather than the typical Chinese knockoff, a leather map case instead of canvas, boots that had been custom-fitted rather than standard issue, an officer or perhaps one of Viet Cong's specialized scouts. The map case contained what he expected, detailed topographical charts of the region, with American patrol routes meticulously marked. But beneath these was something unexpected, a crumpled, water-stained map that didn't match the others. Its edges were ragged, the paper cheaper, and across its surface someone had carved messages using a knife point or similar tool. Griff recognized the handwriting immediately, the same precise, economical script he'd seen in Rollins' field notebook. But these weren't tactical observations. They were warnings, each one scratched with increasing urgency. Not just VC. Something else out here. They use our voices, our radios. Don't trust calls for help. Temple ruins, death, stay clear, VT not in control. Something worse. The final message carved so deeply it had torn through the paper in places. They aren't dead when they should be. God help us. Griff felt a chill that had nothing to do with the physical temperature. Rollins had been a hard-nosed realist, not given to superstition or exaggeration. Whatever had prompted these warnings had genuinely terrified him. Something worse than Viet Cong, something at the temple ruins. He carefully folded the map and secured it in his breast pocket. The information might mean nothing, the desperate scrawlings of a man breaking under torture. Or it might be the key to understanding what they were truly facing in this forgotten corner of the war. A soft rustle in the underbrush brought Griff's weapon up in a smooth, practiced motion. He tracked the sound to its source, a patch of elephant grass swaying against the prevailing breeze. Too deliberate to be wind, too cautious to be wildlife. 3 seconds to identify yourself, Griff called out, voice pitched just loud enough to carry to his target without broadcasting to the entire jungle. A pause, then a familiar voice responded. "It's us." Lin emerged from the vegetation supporting Mac, whose condition appeared marginally improved, conscious at least, though still dangerously weak. "You're early," Griff observed, lowering his weapon, "and in the wrong direction." "Patrol," Mac explained between labored breaths. "Coming up from the south. Kid here thought it best to change course." Griff's gaze shifted to Lin, studying the scout's face for any sign of deception. He found only tension and what might have been fear. Large patrol, Lin elaborated. 12 men, experienced, with dogs. He gestured toward the bodies scattered around them. They will find this soon. We must move. The warning was valid, regardless of motivation. Dogs would follow their scent trail directly to the ambush site, and once Vuthan realized his men had been systematically eliminated, the entire area would swarm with searchers. "How's the leg?" Griff asked Mac, already gathering the salvaged supplies. "Still attached," Mac replied with a ghost of his usual humor. "Antibiotics are helping. Fever's down." He glanced around at the bodies. "I see you've been making friends." Trying to even the odds. Griff handed him a canteen taken from one of the dead fighters. Water was becoming their most precious resource. 2 hours to the LZ. Think you can make it?" Mac's expression hardened with determination. "Just lead the way." As they prepared to move out, Lin suddenly froze, head tilted as if listening intently. "What?" Griff asked, instantly alert. "Helicopter," the scout whispered. "Coming from the east." Griff strained to hear, catching the faint but distinctive thump-thump-thump of rotors still several kilometers distant. Not the scheduled extraction. That would approach from the west, over friendly territory. This was coming from deeper inside North Vietnam. "Down," he ordered, guiding them beneath a thick cluster of broad-leafed plants that provided reasonable concealment from above. The helicopter appeared moments later, a Soviet-made Mi-8 flying low enough that the downdraft bent treetops in its wake. It made a single pass over the general area, then banked sharply south, disappearing as quickly as it had arrived. "Reconnaissance," Lin explained once the sound had faded. "Looking for you." "They're bringing in air assets," Griff muttered, concern evident in his voice. "Vuthan's escalating." "Not Vuthan," Lin corrected, surprising both Americans. "Higher command. North Vietnamese Army, not local VC." This was an unexpected complication. Local VC operations were one thing. They had limited resources and specific territorial boundaries. NVA involvement meant the stakes had risen significantly. "Why would NVA care about 2 Marines in the swamp?" Mac asked, voicing Griff's own question. Lin's expression grew guarded. "Lieutenant's work is important to certain commanders. His methods, his results, his experiments," Griff clarified darkly. The scout nodded once, reluctantly. "He sends reports, detailed, about how Americans think, how they break." Griff processed this information, fitting it into the larger picture forming in his mind. Vuthan wasn't just a sadistic officer indulging personal obsessions. He was developing psychological warfare techniques for broader application. The missing squad, the displayed pilot, Mac left as bait, all data points in a methodology being refined for wider use. It explained the resources devoted to hunting them. Griff wasn't just a Marine evading capture, he was a test subject ruining the experiment. "We need to move," he decided, pushing aside the disturbing implications for later consideration. "East-southeast, parallel to that ridgeline, then swing northeast to approach the LZ from an unexpected angle." They set off at the fastest pace Mac could maintain, which was painfully slow by normal standards. The corporal was fighting hard, pushing through pain with grim determination, but his body had limits that willpower alone couldn't overcome. After 30 minutes, they paused in a small clearing to check his wound and administer another dose of antibiotics. The infection was responding to treatment, but too slowly. The tissue around the entry wound remained angry and inflamed, with thin red lines beginning to spread outward along surrounding blood vessels. "Not good," Mac observed dryly, watching Griff redress the wound. "Could be worse," Griff replied without looking up. "Yeah? How?" "Could be septic, could be gangrenous, could be—" All right, Mac interrupted. "Remind me never to ask you for a pep talk." Despite the banter, both men recognized the gravity of the situation. Even with extraction only hours away, Mac's condition was precarious. The journey was depleting what little reserves he had left. As Griff worked, Lin maintained a vigilant watch, scanning their surroundings with the heightened awareness of someone raised in constant danger. The scout had proven his value repeatedly, warning of patrols before either American detected them, identifying safe paths through treacherous terrain, spotting tripwires and pressure plates that would have claimed their lives. Yet Griff remained cautious. Lin's assistance could still be part of a longer game, earning trust only to betray it at a critical moment. The jungle didn't forgive misplaced faith. "We should continue," Lin urged after Griff had finished treating Mac. Bad feeling. Griff had learned to respect such instincts regardless of their source. "Lead the way, but remember..." "I know." Lin cut him off with unexpected sharpness. "If I betray you, I die first. You have said this." Something in the scout's tone, not fear or resentment but weariness, gave Griff pause. This wasn't the same guarded young man they'd captured less than 24 hours ago. Something had changed. They resumed their journey, moving through increasingly dense vegetation as the terrain gradually rose toward the extraction point. The jungle's character shifted subtly. Older trees, thicker undergrowth, an oppressive stillness broken only by occasional bird calls and the constant drone of insects. Griff felt the weight of observation more intensely here, as if unseen eyes tracked their every movement from the shadowed canopy above. More than once, he spun toward a sound or movement, only to find nothing but shifting patterns of light through leaves. "You feel it too," Lin observed quietly during one such moment. "Feel what?" The scout gestured vaguely at their surroundings. The watching, the waiting. Before Griff could respond, a burst of static erupted from his pack. The shortwave radio he'd salvaged, which he'd kept powered down to conserve its limited battery life. The sudden noise in the silent jungle was jarring, causing all three men to freeze. Griff quickly retrieved the radio, examining it with confusion. The power switch remained in the off position, yet the speaker crackled with increasing intensity. "Nest, day, 6, backup, immediate, ambush." A voice emerged through the static, fragmented but unmistakably American, transmission cutting in and out as if struggling against interference. Mac leaned forward, brow furrowed. "That sounds like Martinez." "Martinez?" Griff questioned. "From Rollins' squad?" "Yeah, our radio man, that's his voice." Griff's unease deepened. "Martinez is dead, you said they executed him." "I know what I said," Mac snapped, then winced as the outburst pulled at his injured leg. "And I know what I'm hearing, that's him." The radio crackled again, the voice slightly clearer. "Repeat, this is Sierra Actual requesting immediate extraction. We are surrounded, coordinates." The transmission dissolved into static once more, then silence. Griff checked the radio, thoroughly, confirming what he already knew. It remained powered off, the battery connections undisturbed. "That's not possible," he murmured. Lin had retreated several steps, his expression a mixture of fear and understanding. "The dead speak," he whispered, like the elders warned. "What are you talking about?" Griff demanded. "The swamp ghosts," Lin explained, voice hushed as if afraid of being overheard. "Souls trapped between worlds. They use the voices of the recently dead to lure the living. The elders say they hunger for company." Under normal circumstances, Griff would have dismissed such talk as superstition, but Rollins' warning scratched into the map echoed in his mind. "They use our voices, our radios. Don't trust calls for help." "There's a rational explanation," he insisted, as much to himself as to the others. "Radio waves bouncing off the ionosphere, equipment malfunction, psychological warfare." "Then why is your radio broadcasting when it's turned off?" Mackie asked pointedly. Before Griff could formulate a response, the speaker crackled once more. This time the voice was different, deeper, authoritative, and chillingly familiar. "Griffin." It was Sergeant Rollins, his distinctive bass rumbling through the static. "Parameter breach. They're inside the wire. Don't approach my position. I repeat, do not approach the temple. Something's wrong with..." The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving only dead air. "That wasn't a recording," Mac said quietly. That was real time. Griff stared at the silent radio, mental gears turning rapidly. Possible explanations cascaded through his mind, each less plausible than the last. VC psychological operations using captured recordings, some bizarre atmospheric phenomenon bouncing old transmissions back to Earth, or something darker, something that aligned with Rollins's increasingly frantic warnings. The temple, he murmured. Rollins mentioned it again, and it's on his map. Temple ruins, Saiskorn death. What temple? Mac asked. Lin's face had drained of color. The old temple north of here, very old, before French, before emperors, where the forest reclaimed the stone. You know it? The scout nodded reluctantly. All know it, all avoid it. Bad place. And that's where Vuitton has his base camp, Griff recalled from earlier conversations. The place you warned us to avoid. Lin's eyes widened. How did you told us, yesterday. When I asked where Vuitton's base was, you said, old temple ruins. The scout shook his head vehemently. No, never there. No soldier goes there. Too many accidents. A chill crawled up Griff's spine despite the swamp's oppressive heat. Either Lin was lying now, or he'd been lying before, or, most disturbing of all, something had altered his memory of the conversation. Griff pulled out Rollin's map, unfolding it carefully to preserve the fragile, water-damaged paper. Where is this temple in relation to our position? After a moment's hesitation, Lin pointed to an area approximately 4 kilometers northwest of their current location. The map showed only dense jungle in that region, no structures or landmarks of any kind. Not on maps, the scout explained, only in stories. Griff studied the area, noting its position relative to their extraction point and the patterns of warnings Rollins had carved. Something significant had happened there, something that had terrified a battle-hardened Marine sergeant enough that he'd used his final moments to warn others away. The radio crackled again, but this time no voice emerged, only a sequence of sounds that raised the hair on Griff's neck. 3 taps, followed by 3 longer tones, followed by 3 more taps. SOS in Morse code, universally recognized as a distress signal. We need to move, Griff decided, returning the radio and map to his pack. Now. Toward the extraction point, Mac clarified. Not whatever haunted temple is broadcasting ghost. Radio, right? Extraction point, Griff confirmed, though a part of him, the part that had never left a man behind that still carried the weight of 5 dog tags, pulled in the other direction. They resumed their journey with renewed urgency, pushing Mac's endurance to its limits. The terrain grew steadily more challenging. Steeper slopes, denser vegetation, occasional rocky outcroppings that forced detours. The jungle seemed to resist their progress, branches catching equipment, roots threatening to trip unwary feet, visibility decreasing as the canopy thickened overhead. An hour into this grueling advance, they crested a small ridge and came upon a scene that stopped them in their tracks. Below, in a natural hollow surrounded by massive trees, lay the remains of what could only be described as a slaughter. 6 or 7 bodies, it was difficult to establish an exact count given their condition, lay scattered across the hollow. They wore the tattered remnants of VC uniforms, but the damage inflicted upon them went far beyond standard combat injuries. Limbs had been wrenched from bodies with force that no human could generate. Torsos were split open, internal organs missing. One man's head had been twisted completely backward, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Jesus Christ, Mac breathed, instinctively making the sign of the cross despite professing no particular religious belief. Griff approached cautiously, weapon ready, senses hyper-alert. The scene was fresh. Blood still glistened wetly on leaves and exposed flesh. Whatever had done this had been here recently, perhaps within the hour. Not animals, he observed, examining the nearest body. Too deliberate, too... He struggled to find the right word. Methodical. Lin remained at the edge of the hollow, refusing to approach despite Griff's gesture to advance. The scout's face had taken on an ashen quality, his eyes wide with a primal fear that transcended language and culture. "We should not be here," he whispered. "This is their hunting ground." "Whose hunting ground?" Griff demanded. Lin shook his head, eyes darting to the surrounding jungle as if expecting attack from any direction. "No name. The old ones. Before people." Mac, who had hobbled forward to join Griff, nodded toward something clutched in the hand of one of the dead fighters. "Check that out." The man's fingers were locked around a crumpled photograph, held with such force that his nails had cut into his own palm. Griff carefully extracted it, revealing a black and white image of what appeared to be a stone structure. Ancient columns supporting a partially collapsed roof. Walls covered in carvings unlike any he'd seen before. Not Vietnamese, not Khmer, not Chinese. Something older, cruder, more primal. The temple. Turning the photo over, Griff found a single sentence written in Vietnamese. "They have awakened it." A sudden realization struck him. These men weren't random VC fighters caught in an ambush or animal attack. Their equipment, their positioning, even the fact that they carried a photograph of the temple, these were Vu Than's men. His elite, scouts or soldiers sent to the temple for some purpose that had ended in their brutal demise. "We need to go. Now." Griff's voice left no room for argument. As they turned to leave, the radio in his pack erupted once more, not with static or fragmented voices, but with a scream so raw, so primal, that it seemed to pierce directly into their minds rather than their ears. It lasted several seconds, modulating from human to something else entirely before cutting off as abruptly as it had begun. In the silence that followed, Mac's labored breathing seemed unnaturally loud. "That wasn't one of ours, Griff," he whispered, face pale beneath the fever flush. "I think we're following ghosts." The extraction point lay 3 kilometers southeast, a journey that would challenge Mac's failing strength, but remained their only hope of survival. Whatever had happened at the temple, whatever had massacred Vu Than's men in the hollow, it was beyond their mission parameters, beyond their capabilities to confront. Yet as they moved away from the grisly scene, Griff couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial, that the answers to what was happening in this forgotten corner of the war lay in the ancient ruins Rollins had warned them to avoid. The jungle watched them go, its silence more menacing than any sound could be, and somewhere nearby, something that should not exist continued its hunt, adding new ghosts to a landscape already overflowing with the restless dead. Up next we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.